March 1945. Western Germany. Dawn arrives without ceremony. A low gray sky hangs over narrow roads, churned into mud by weeks of retreat. Exhaust smoke drifts through bare trees. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbles, but it no longer sounds coordinated. It sounds exhausted. Along a country road, German soldiers move in clusters, not formations. Helmets are scuffed. Rifles hang loose at their sides. Some pull wagons. Others limp. Trucks sit abandoned in ditches, out of fuel, their engines still warm. Orders have stopped arriving. Maps no longer match the reality on the ground. Ahead of them, unseen at first, American infantry occupies the high ground. Foxholes cut into wet earth. Machine guns zero down the road. Radios crackle with calm, measured voices. This unit has not advanced today. It has waited. By mid-morning, the road becomes impassable, not because it is blocked by wreckage, but because the men on it no longer know where to go. Columns halt. Officers argue. Then the first white cloth appears. A handkerchief. A shirt tied to a stick. What is happening here is not a battle in the traditional sense. It is the moment an army realizes it has been surrounded, not by millions of men, but by inevitability. By early 1945, the war in Western Europe had entered a strange and uneven phase. On paper, the German army still existed in massive numbers. Entire formations remained listed on strength reports. Divisions still carried historic names. Army groups still appeared on maps. But in reality, the force that faced the Western Allies was no longer an army in the modern sense. It was a collection of exhausted units held together by habit, fear, and the shrinking geography of defeat. The collapse began months earlier, after the failure of Germany's final major counteroffensive in the Ardennes. When that gamble failed, the German High Command lost more than troops and tanks. It lost the last reserve of initiative. From that moment on, the war in the West became a matter of time and pressure. The Allies no longer needed dramatic breakthroughs. They needed continuity, relentless, coordinated movement that denied the enemy rest. By March 1945, Allied forces had reached the Rhine, the last major natural barrier before Germany's industrial heartland. When the river was crossed during Operation Plunder, it was not a gamble. It was a calculation. The bridges went up faster than German artillery could respond. Air superiority smothered movement by day. Fuel shortages paralyzed movement by night. Beyond the Rhine lay the Ruhr, the industrial core of Germany. Coal, steel, rail yards, and factories were packed into a dense urban basin. For decades, it had powered German military production. Now it was becoming a trap. Roads converged inward. Rail lines ran east and west, but offered few exits. Rivers cut across retreat routes. What had once been an engine of war became a pocket waiting to close. The German forces inside this region were enormous in number, but hollow in capability. Many were rear area troops, anti-aircraft units, training battalions, or remnants of divisions shattered months earlier. Weapons existed, but ammunition was uneven. Tanks existed, but fuel did not. Radios existed, but command chains were fractured. Orders often arrived late, contradicted each other, or never arrived at all. At the strategic level, German leadership faced an impossible choice. Holding the Ruhr was symbolically vital. It was Germany's last industrial region. Abandoning it meant acknowledging the war was lost. But defending it required mobility, coordination, and reserves that no longer existed. Instead of a coherent withdrawal, the German army drifted into the basin, compressed by Allied advances from multiple directions. American forces, by contrast, had reached a level of operational maturity that allowed divisions to operate independently while remaining connected to a larger design. Infantry divisions were no longer just frontline units pushing forward. They were blocking forces, encirclement anchors, and containment tools. Once positioned, they did not need to advance rapidly. They needed only to hold key terrain, bridges, ridgelines, road junctions, and deny escape. This is where the imbalance of late war combat became clear. A single American division, properly supplied and positioned, could exert influence far beyond its numerical strength. Not because it fought harder, but because it fought within a system that still functioned. Communications worked. Artillery responded. Air support arrived on call. Logistics flowed forward, not backward. Inside the Ruhr, German commanders still spoke in the language of maneuver. Breakouts, counterattacks, redeployments. But on the ground, their soldiers experienced something very different. Movement meant exposure to air attack. Concentration meant artillery fire. Roads were clogged not by traffic discipline, but by despair. The stage was being set, not for a dramatic last stand, but for something quieter and more devastating. The disintegration of an army through containment. And as the Allied ring tightened, one American division would find itself holding a position that turned retreat into surrender. The geography of Western Germany now dictated the war more than any plan drawn on paper. The Ruhr Basin was not open country. It was dense, industrial, and constricted. Rivers like the Ruhr and the Lippe cut across movement corridors. Rail lines converged towards cities already shattered by bombing. Roads that once carried coal and steel now carried men moving in the wrong direction. When American and British forces crossed the Rhine in multiple locations, German commanders attempted to organize a fighting withdrawal. But withdrawals require time, fuel, and coordination. None were available in sufficient quantity. Allied air power dominated daylight hours. Columns that moved openly were broken apart from above. Vehicles burned on the shoulders of roads. Horses collapsed under loads meant for trucks that no longer ran. Inside the pocket, German Army Group B, nominally still a functioning headquarters, attempted to reassert control. Orders were issued to form defensive lines along rivers and towns. In reality, units rarely reached their assigned positions intact. Some never received the orders at all. Others arrived only to discover neighboring units had already vanished. By this stage of the war, the German army's greatest weakness was no longer firepower. It was cohesion. Companies were filled with men from different units who had never trained together. Officers commanded soldiers they had met only days earlier. Supply depots existed on maps, but had been destroyed or abandoned weeks before. Even when German units wanted to fight, they often could not fight together. American forces approaching the Ruhr operated under a different reality. Divisions advanced on parallel axes, not racing one another, but closing space. The goal was not annihilation in open battle. It was containment. Each road secured, each bridge held, reduced the enemy's options. The battlefield became smaller by the hour. Within this design, individual American divisions were assigned specific roles. Some pressed inward. Others formed the outer ring, sealing escape routes. It was here, on these secondary roads and river crossings, that a single division could decide the fate of tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. Holding ground became more important than taking it. American infantry dug in on high ground, overlooking choke points. Artillery was pre-registered on roads and intersections. Engineers prepared demolitions on bridges, not to destroy them immediately, but to control when and how they could be used. Everything was deliberate. Everything was calm. 4 German troops attempting to escape the pocket. These positions were invisible until it was too late. A road that appeared open at dawn could be under observation by noon. A bridge that seemed intact could suddenly become a killing zone. Even when contact was light, the message was unmistakable. There was no clear way out. As days passed, German movement slowed further. Columns bunched up. Supplies ran out. Commanders faced a choice between attempting desperate breakouts or holding position and hoping for orders that never came. Discipline eroded not through cowardice, but through exhaustion and confusion. By the final week of March 1945, the encirclement was no longer theoretical. It was physical. American units now faced inward as often as outward. The pocket had formed, and pressure was increasing from every direction. Within this tightening ring, one American division occupied a sector that appeared quiet on the map, but in reality controlled the fate of the entire trapped force. The Germans inside the Ruhr still believed escape was possible. They were wrong. For the American infantrymen holding the perimeter, this phase of the war did not feel triumphant. There were no sweeping advances, no flags raised over captured cities. Instead, there was waiting, long hours in foxholes carved into damp ground. Boots never fully dried. The smell of cordite lingered even on quiet days. These soldiers understood their role clearly. They were not here to chase the enemy. They were here to deny him movement. Machine guns were positioned to cover roads that saw little traffic. Mortar teams rehearsed firing plans they hoped never to use. Artillery observers watched empty fields, knowing that emptiness itself was a sign of success. Contact, when it came, was brief and uneven. Small groups of German soldiers appeared, probing for weaknesses. Sometimes they surrendered immediately. Sometimes they fired a few shots and withdrew. Rarely did they attack in strength. The American response was controlled, professional, and measured. There was no need to pursue. Every step forward risked opening a gap behind them. What defined this experience was not fear, but patience. These men had survived in Normandy, the hedgerows, the Ardennes. By now, they understood the rhythm of collapse. When an enemy stopped attacking, it was not because he was regrouping. It was because he was running out of options. The German perspective, an army without direction. Inside the pocket, The German soldier lived in a different world. Orders were vague or contradictory. Maps were outdated. Officers argued quietly, away from the men. Everyone understood that the front no longer existed as a line. It was a series of shrinking spaces. Morale did not collapse all at once. It drained slowly. First went confidence in command, then confidence in supply. Finally, confidence in the future. Men still carried rifles, but fewer checked their sights. Ammunition was conserved not for a final stand, but because resupply was unlikely. Rumors spread faster than orders. Some spoke of breakthroughs to the east. Others claimed the Americans would allow mass surrender. No one knew what to believe. Movement itself became dangerous, not because of enemy fire, but because every road led to uncertainty. The tactical angle, blocking instead of destroying. From a tactical standpoint, this operation represented a shift in how American divisions fought late in the war. The goal was not to annihilate German units in open battle. It was to block, contain, and wait. Roadblocks were placed not where fighting was expected, but where movement was inevitable. Fire plans were designed to discourage advance rather than invite combat. Artillery fired warning concentrations before committing to full barges. Every engagement was shaped to send the same message: retreat is no longer possible. This approach reduced American casualties and accelerated German collapse. Fighting less did not mean achieving less. It meant allowing the enemy's own logistical and psychological failures to do the work. As this pressure mounted, the situation inside the pocket grew more desperate and more unstable. By this stage of the war, American divisional leadership had shed any remaining illusions about decisive battlefield heroics. Success was measured in maps updated, roads sealed, and time denied. Orders were short. Objectives were narrow. Hold this junction. Secure that bridge. Maintain contact with adjacent units. Division commanders understood something German leadership no longer could. When an enemy is collapsing, clarity matters more than boldness. American officers resisted the temptation to advance unnecessarily. They did not seek glory in deep thrusts. They sought certainty. Every mile held was a mile denied. German leadership inside the pocket faced the opposite problem. Orders still came from above, but they were based on conditions that no longer existed. Commanders spoke of regrouping, of counterattacks, of delaying actions. On the ground, these words felt detached from reality. The men could see the sky. They could hear the engines overhead. They could count the rounds left in their pouches. As communication failed, authority weakened. Officers retained rank, but not influence. Leadership became reactive rather than directive. Decisions were made locally, often by necessity rather than doctrine. Some units attempted breakouts without coordination. Others dug in without purpose. A few waited, doing nothing at all. Technology and logistics, systems that still worked. The difference between the two sides was not courage or experience. It was systems. American logistics still functioned under pressure. Fuel arrived. Ammunition arrived. Food arrived. Radios worked. Artillery batteries could respond within minutes, not hours. This reliability allowed restraint. American units did not need to gamble. If a position came under threat, they could call for fire. If a road saw movement, it could be interdicted. If weather grounded aircraft, artillery compensated. Redundancy ensured control. German logistics, by contrast, had collapsed in layers. Fuel shortages immobilized vehicles. Ammunition depots were empty or unreachable. Rail lines were destroyed. Even horse transport became unreliable as animals collapsed from exhaustion. Technology existed, but it could not be sustained. An army can endure losses. It cannot endure uncertainty. By late March, German units inside the pocket no longer knew what support might arrive, or if any would arrive at all. Moral and psychological angle, the quiet end. Perhaps the most decisive angle of all was psychological. German soldiers were not being defeated in dramatic set-piece battles. They were being denied purpose. Each day passed without progress. Each night brought fewer options. The Americans understood this instinctively. They did not taunt. They did not broadcast threats. They waited. Checkpoints became places of inevitability rather than confrontation. When Germans approached, weapons were held at the ready, but not raised in panic. The act of surrender, when it came, was often quiet. Rifles laid down carefully. Hands raised without shouting. Relief mixed with shame. Not because the men believed they had failed personally, but because they understood the war had ended for them here, without ceremony. As these surrenders multiplied, the pressure inside the pocket reached a breaking point. Entire formations began to dissolve. What remained was only the question of when and where the collapse would become undeniable. That moment was now approaching. The final phase began not with an order, but with silence. In the last days of March 1945, German attempts at coordinated movement inside the pocket simply stopped. Not because fighting had intensified, but because there was nowhere left to move. Roads were sealed. Bridges were held. River crossings were watched day and night. The perimeter no longer shifted. It hardened. For the American division anchoring one critical sector of the encirclement, the change was unmistakable. Radio traffic dropped. Enemy probing attacks faded away. Instead of scattered fire, there were columns, long, disorganized columns, moving cautiously toward American lines with no intention of breaking through. These are not assault formations. They were remnants. German officers still attempted structure. Men were grouped by unit where possible. Flags and improvised signs appeared. Some columns marched under white cloths tied to rifles. Others halted at a distance, waiting for instructions that would never come. American infantry companies adjusted quietly. Machine guns stayed trained on approach routes. Artillery remained registered, but inactive. The goal was no longer to stop movement by force. It was to control the moment of surrender. When contact occurred, it was procedural. An American officer would step forward. A German officer would follow. There were no speeches, no declarations, only numbers exchanged, units identified, weapons collected, prisoners directed to assembly points already planned days earlier. As word spread through the pocket, resistance collapsed unevenly. Some German formations surrendered intact, thousands at a time. Others dissolved completely, their soldiers approaching in small groups or alone. Attempts to escape through forests or secondary roads failed. Every path led back to the same reality. The American division at the center of this process did not advance more than a few hundred yards in days. It did not need to. The enemy was coming to it. By early April, the scale of what was happening became impossible to ignore. Prisoner counts rose into the tens of thousands. Guard units were reinforced not for combat, but for control. Supply trucks now carried rations not only for American troops, but for captured enemy soldiers. Inside the pocket, the last illusion of maneuver died. German commanders could no longer pretend this was a temporary setback. The encirclement was complete. The army inside it was finished. The only question left was how long it would take for the final order to be acknowledged. The end did not come with a last stand. It came with an order no one expected to hear. In early April 1945, inside the sealed Ruhr pocket, German senior commanders finally confronted what junior officers and enlisted men already understood. The front no longer existed. Communications between units were sporadic or non-existent. Ammunition levels were irrelevant without mobility. Fuel shortages had frozen armor where it stood. Even if a breakout were attempted, there was no destination left to reach. The American division, holding its sector of the encirclement, now faced a problem of scale rather than resistance. Prisoners arrived faster than they could be processed. Entire battalions surrendered at once, then regiments, then what remained of divisions, often little more than a name and a handful of officers trying to preserve order. At designated points along roads and fields, German units stacked weapons in orderly piles. Machine guns laid next to rifles. Sidearms placed carefully on helmets. The ritual was repeated again and again, thousands of times, until the piles stretched across open ground like markers of an army that had ceased to exist. American troops did not cheer. There was no celebration. The work was methodical. Prisoners were counted, searched, fed, and marched to temporary holding areas. Medical teams treated wounded Germans alongside Americans. Guards were reassigned from combat duty to crowd control. The numbers climbed with astonishing speed. By the time the pocket fully collapsed, approximately 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner within this sector of the encirclement alone. An estimated 13,000 German troops lay dead, many from earlier fighting, air attack, or failed breakout attempts in the weeks leading up to surrender. What made the moment remarkable was not violence, but its absence. The final act of one of Germany's largest remaining field forces unfolded quietly, under overcast skies, without a decisive battle to mark its end. For the American division, at the center of this collapse, the war did not feel victorious. It felt finished. Their mission had not been to destroy an army in combat, but to stand in the place where an army could no longer escape itself. As the last columns surrendered and the pocket emptied of resistance, the wider consequences of this collapse began to unfold beyond the battlefield. The Ruhr pocket's collapse reshaped the final phase of the Western Front almost overnight. For the Allies, the capture of 90,000 German soldiers at once was unprecedented in scale since the fall of France 5 years earlier. Entire divisions that had been listed as combat-ready simply vanished. Equipment, artillery, vehicles, and stockpiles fell into Allied hands, providing a sudden and dramatic reinforcement of resources already stretched thin by months of continuous operations. Immediate consequences were logistical as much as tactical. Prisoners needed to be fed, clothed, and transported to camps far from the front. Roads and rail lines, previously clogged with retreating columns, had to accommodate both Allied supply convoys and captured German forces. Every hour the American division spent holding its position prevented a potential breakout, but it also created a temporary bottleneck, an organizational challenge unlike anything the troops had faced since Normandy. Engineers and quartermasters worked constantly, moving prisoners, securing captured arms, and converting abandoned German trucks and artillery for use where possible. The human cost of the operation was stark. Among the dead were 13,000 German soldiers, many killed in previous air and artillery attacks, others in the futile attempts to escape encirclement. Civilians, caught in the shrinking pocket, were forced to flee in small groups or remain under Army supervision, adding to the complexity. Reports from forward observers noted the scale of destruction: bombed-out factories, scorched vehicles, and ruined towns that had served as defensive positions. For the American division, casualty figures were surprisingly low. The methodical containment approach minimized frontal assaults. Soldiers spent long days in observation posts and foxholes, prepared for attacks that rarely came. This combination of preparation, discipline, and logistics allowed the division to achieve a strategic victory far larger than its numerical size might suggest. One division, operating under clear orders and supported by functional supply lines, had effectively neutralized an army several times its size. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate. German officers within the pocket wrote detailed after-action reports that stressed the hopelessness of their situation. Soldiers who surrendered often described walking into captivity like it was inevitable, a reflection of the collapse of morale long before actual combat ended. On the American side, veterans noted the surreal nature of controlling tens of thousands of prisoners without firing a single shot, an unspoken acknowledgement that strategy, positioning, and timing could achieve what brute force alone could not. The Ruhr Pocket's fall also signaled to higher Allied command that the war in Germany could no longer be prolonged by scattered resistance in the West. With one decisive encirclement, the Allies removed the last concentrated German formations capable of defending the industrial heartland. Bridges, roads, and railways that had been the arteries of German war production now became tools for moving prisoners and supplies, shifting the momentum irreversibly in favor of the Western Allies. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the collapse of the Ruhr Pocket sent shockwaves through German command. The High Command, already fractured and desperate, faced the undeniable reality that tens of thousands of troops had vanished from the order of battle without meaningful resistance. Army Group B, which nominally controlled the region, ceased to function as an operational headquarters. Communication lines were severed, and what authority remained existed only on paper. Commanders further east attempted to organize withdrawals or patch together defensive lines, but the loss of the Ruhr's manpower made such efforts meaningless. Strategically, the The pocket's fall accelerated the Allied advance into central Germany. With the Ruhr cleared, forces could push eastward unopposed, moving toward the Elbe and ultimately Berlin. Fuel, munitions, and captured vehicles from the pocket were quickly redistributed to support continued operations, giving American units operational flexibility that previously would have required weeks of preparation. The speed of the collapse also allowed higher commands to consolidate their forces, minimize gaps, and tighten encirclements in other sectors, compounding the pressure on the remaining German formations. The psychological effect on German troops outside the pocket was equally significant. Soldiers, hearing reports of mass surrenders and the disappearance of entire divisions, became increasingly hesitant to resist. The lesson was unmistakable. Fighting to preserve positions that were already untenable was futile. Some units surrendered preemptively. Others offered only token resistance before retreating. The collapse demonstrated that armies could disintegrate not solely from enemy action, but from logistical failure, command breakdown, and the inevitability of encirclement. American leadership took note of the operation as a case study in modern warfare. The division responsible for holding the critical sector was praised not for heroics in combat, but for precision in execution. The effectiveness of containment over direct assault, the integration of artillery and air support with infantry positions, and the careful planning of prisoner management became lessons in operational efficiency. It showed that a single, well-organized, well-led division could have strategic impact far beyond its immediate front. In Germany, the surrender was recorded in operational logs and after-action reports with a tone of resignation. Numbers 13,000 dead, 90,000 captured were cited, but there was no dramatic narrative of resistance. The collapse had been silent, methodical, and final. It left the industrial heartland of Germany open to occupation, the Ruhr's factories idle, and the remaining German forces aware that their fight was now a matter of survival rather than strategy. With the Ruhr effectively cleared, the stage was set for the final months of the war in Europe. One division's steadfast hold had transformed what might have been a prolonged campaign into a rapid, decisive conclusion. The scale of surrender, the speed of collapse, and the operational precision of containment became a defining example of late-war American strategy. The collapse of the Ruhr pocket was not a spectacle of heroism. It was a quiet demonstration of what modern warfare had become by 1945. Systems, logistics, and timing mattered more than courage alone. One American division, standing firm on a single stretch of road and ridgeline, had reshaped the fate of tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. It was a moment when the inevitability of defeat outweighed any possibility of resistance. For the men inside the pocket, surrender was less humiliation than relief. They walked into captivity knowing that their struggle had ended, not in fire and steel, but in order and inevitability. For the American infantry, the victory was measured not in dramatic charges, but in patience, discipline, and the quiet execution of a plan that allowed an army to collapse around them without a pitched battle. The Ruhr episode also revealed a broader truth about warfare. Armies can die silently. They do not always perish in explosions, smoke, and screams. Sometimes they perish through the erosion of command, the paralysis of logistics, and the psychological realization that no further action can change the outcome. The Germans had fought bravely in other campaigns, but by late March 1945, the structure that made them an army was gone. History remembers the numbers: 13,000 dead, 90,000 captured, but the lesson lies in the method. Strategy, preparation, and positioning can achieve outcomes far greater than brute force alone. The collapse of the Ruhr pocket was a testament to operational foresight, to the quiet power of discipline, and to the sobering reality that sometimes the end of an army is as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. It was not a battle, not a charge, not a stand. It was the death of an army by inevitability, and the world watched as one division held the line while history quietly unfolded around it.